Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is actually part 2 of the episode Top 20 Cases of Human Levitation. In part 1 we covered cases 20 through 11 and now we're going to do a countdown of the top 10. So let's just get started. 10, and this is when things really get exciting. For case number 10, I chose the case of MAHAYOGINI RAJALAKSHMI. This case is well verified in many respects. This took place in India. The main witness is still living, I believe, and is of high credibility. At the time, she held a position as a professor and a leader of a yoga institute. Her levitations have been witnessed by numerous people and were also allegedly photographed. This is a really compelling case which occurred in the 1900s. The exact date isn't given, but it was investigated by well-respected researcher Doug Boyd, who is a Native American civil rights leader and the founder of the Cross-Cultural Studies program in Tucson, Arizona. In the 1980s, he was funded by the Menninger Foundation to travel across the world to interview a variety of yogi adepts and study their ability to control states of consciousness and psychophysiological states, or in other words, the mind-body connection. And one of their subjects was this extraordinary woman by the name of MAHAYOGINI RAJALAKSHMI. She lived in Tirupati, India, and at the time, she was the professor of biochemistry at the University of Sri Padmavati. Doug Boyd couldn't help but notice that Rajalakshmi was different from the many other yogis he had met. First of all, she was young, she was female, she drove a fancy sports car, she dressed with expensive jewelry, and was, according to Doug Boyd, strikingly beautiful. However, Doug Boyd was assured by those around her that she was a genuine yogi, and as a child, she had actually created a local sensation in her village because of her ability to levitate. As Doug Boyd writes, Rajalakshmi had been somewhat of a legend in her own hometown during her childhood, we were told. As a child, she had begun to meditate and had experienced many occurrences of transcending gravity. At times, she would levitate, and at times she would turn upside down and levitate on her head. She was so often and so long in levitation that people came from near and far to see her. These things occurred spontaneously and were not entirely in her own control. It had created a problem for the wealthy family, and they had to hire guards because of the crowds. During his meeting with her, Doug Boyd was actually shown photographic evidence of her levitations. As he says, and I quote, "Among the snapshots of Rajalakshmi were several photographs taken by a newspaper journalist showing her sitting in a lotus position and levitating about a foot off the floor. On one of these in particular, it looked as though some external force, almost like a great wind or perhaps vacuum, were acting upon her and lifting her into the air. Her hair and clothing seemed to be blowing in several directions, while her expression and her posture appeared still and calm." Doug Boyd was amazed by these photos and learned that Rajalakshmi had given demonstrations of her abilities on numerous occasions, including once for a group of students and faculty at the university where she taught. He finally asked her about this ability, and she replied, and I quote, "It does not happen nowadays, well, not spontaneously as before, and it was never an objective of mine, not something I was seeking. It was like an automatic sort of thing, and it gave me problems at times. In college, I had to stay alone because I had several times alarmed my roommates. This is a surprising thing, you see, when it is so unusual for them and unexpected. As a young girl when this happened, I was amazed, I can say, but I was not frightened. Yet it startled my parents. To them it appeared an emergency, something dangerous happening to their daughter, so they were quite upset enough to seek help. Not the first time, the third or fourth time perhaps. You see, I went straight up from my bed, which was against the wall. We have these high windows with inside shutters, and I hit the shutter. Normally I would not reach the shutter, and it made such a loud sound in the night, my parents came rushing in, and seeing me suspended in the air in that manner, they were startled, and my father shouted at me. Perhaps that in itself brought me down, and I became fully conscious. Rajalakshmi knows exactly what caused her ability to start levitating. She says, I was in meditation, and even though I was not fully conscious of my body, I knew what happened and why. You see, my teacher chose for me this wonderful book, the Gospel of Ramakrishna. So I would read this book, and it was so inspirational for me. It opened me to something. I used to meditate on this, though I had not been doing meditation. I would read some pages and become so moved, and I would meditate on this emotion. I read it in the evening instead of my homework. I had not much worry for homework as I was excelling in my classwork, and I read this book instead when my parents thought I was doing homework. So this thing did it. It put me into levitation. This book was the cause of it in the beginning. I have this book. It's more than 1,000 pages long, and it details the life of a spiritual master, Ramakrishna, who is himself a levitator. So to stop these levitations, Rajalakshmi's parents forbade her from reading this book and sought help from the leading sage in their village. He advised them that their daughter was a yogi and that they should seek a guru. The guru instructed the parents to have no fears, that levitation was natural, and to allow her to read the book. The parents agreed, but they weren't happy about it, as Rajalakshmi says. So then it went on for some time. I went on reading my book and remained long hours in meditation and long hours in levitation. So the villagers learned of this and they came. Others began to arrive from here and there. My father would not let them see me. And at last there were crowds of people, men, women, children, sleeping and washing and preparing meals in our property. The police were called at this point, and they said that they were unable to order the people away, and the best solution would be some sort of compromise. Just allow them to view the girl levitating for short periods. And Rajalakshmi's parents reluctantly agreed, as she says. So the days of the weeks and the hours were set, and the people could come in, a few at a time, in one door and out the other. There were ropes put up between, so they could not touch me. After a few months of this, Rajalakshmi was advised by her guru to stop the levitations as she was becoming, quote, lost in bliss, and becoming, quote, useless in your lifetime. So she stopped the levitating trances. Today, Rajalakshmi is focusing her energy on more practical pursuits, including running a yoga institute and teaching at the university and working at a health clinic. One of her students credits her with helping her to cure his diabetes. So how about that? What an incredible case. And that's just case number 10. I've got many other cases, and I want to move on quickly because this is quite a long episode. Next case I want to talk about is the case of Alphonse Liguori. This case occurred an extremely long time ago, but there are a huge number of credible witnesses who left written testimonies under oath testifying to the veracity of Liguori's levitations. Saint Alphonse Marie de Liguori was born in 1696, and although he's not really well known among the many levitating saints, his remains one of the strongest cases on record for the veracity of this phenomenon. He experienced numerous levitations, at least 2 of which were witnessed by extremely large numbers of people, several of whom left very convincing written testimonials. Saint Liguori grew up with little interest in religion. Instead, he was a student of the law. By age 16, was a very successful lawyer. 8 years later, he was still practicing law. He had a perfect record. He won every single case he represented until 1720, when he lost a very important case because he made a simple, stupid mistake. And this upset him a lot. It made him think deeply about course his life was taking and what he wanted to do with his life. and as a result, he left law practice against his father's wishes and instead became deeply religious. He became ordained as a priest at the age of 30 and soon became a very popular confessor and preacher, and he eventually founded numerous missions throughout Naples, Italy. Today he is credited with many, many miracles, including visions and prophecies, which were later verified as accurate, and of course, levitations. His most famous levitation is undoubtedly the one that took place in December 1745. While preaching before more than 2,000 people, Alphonse Liguori fell into an ecstasy and rose several feet above the platform on which he stood. The crowd fell into stone silence and then began to cry out, "Miracle! Miracle!" During Liguori's trial for beatification, multiple witnesses testified to this event, and it wasn't his only levitation. In 1756, again while preaching before a crowd of more than 1,000 people, he experienced another levitation, and again the crowd became very emotional. One witness, Father Casanova, wrote, and I quote, "We saw his body glow, his eyes fixed, ravished in ecstasy, to rise 2 palms above the chair, appearing as though an angel was flying him to heaven. This ravishment lasted for more than 5 minutes, during which erupted an indescribable emotion, the sobbing of the audience mingling with cries from all sides of 'Miracle! Miracle! Miracle!'" Another witness was Father Criscoli, who says, "I am knowledgeable enough to know this happened. I particularly remember the complete transformation of 2/4 of the town." Father Criscoli elaborated and reported that many of the prostitutes and drunks changed their ways and improved their moral standing as a direct result of witnessing Liguori's levitation. Another witness was Francois de Stefano, who said, and I quote, "All the people saw him as I myself saw him, that he experienced a state of ecstasy. His eyes were turned to the sky, and his body raised up more than 2 palms." The quality and the number of testimonies avowing to Liguori's levitations leave little doubt that they were true. Another witness was Brother Verdesca, who says, and I quote, "At the beginning of 1762, I went one morning in order to recite, as is the custom, the office with him. Upon entering his room, I saw him elevated 2 or 3 palms above his chair, half kneeling, half sitting. He had his arms extended, his eyes opened and raised towards the sky, his face glowing brightly as though transfigured. I entered quietly into the room and kneeled between the armchair and the bed in a way which allowed me, in turning my head, to watch his figure. The ravishment lasted about 1/4 of an hour, but for me this seemed only an instant, and all the while my eyes streamed tears. I considered the spectacle very heavenly." He expressed a profound gasp and cried out, "My God, my God!" He recovered at this moment and found himself on his chair in his normal state. I burst out sobbing, at which he noticed my presence and became confused. Turning towards me, he said with a gentle but reproachful tone, "Unfortunate you were there. Above all, tell no one what you have seen." According to the witness, Liguori seemed very disoriented as a result of the levitation. Another first-hand witness was Father Magella, who apparently prevented the levitation. As he says, "In March of 1770 I attended his Mass. That morning I saw him more excited than usual, and as though in a kind of fear. He recited the prayers of the Holy Mass up to the canon with an ineffable devotion. I knelt to celebrate the Holy Sacrifice, and I stopped a moment to observe. As soon as I saw that the consecration didn't happen, I raised my eyes and I saw him leaning on his elbows on the altar, holding the host in his hand without saying the words of the sacrament. In raising my head a little, I was able to see his face. His eyes were opened hugely and fixed on the cross, all of this revealing an animation which made me shudder. Then I discovered that he was touching the ground only by his toes, as if he was going to take flight. Completely beside myself and not knowing what to do, I went to call Brother Romito or the servant Alex, and not finding them, returned to the altar. The servant of God was still in the same position. I then took him, as I had under similar circumstances, and shook him strongly, pulling him by his cassock. This movement made him recover. In leaving his ecstasy, he heaved a great gasp of love and pronounced the consecration. He finished the Mass with the fervor of an angel. Father Volpicelli reported that he once accidentally provoked Liguori into a levitation by speaking to him of the love of God. And in 1784, Father Tanoja observed Liguori, now severely ill with rheumatism, levitating, and he left a detailed account. As Father Tanoja says, Alphonse was before the altar of the very holy sacrament. I heard him move his feet as if he slid across the pavement. This sound began a few moments later, and suspecting that something supernatural was happening to him, I glanced to the side and I saw him elevated in the air above his chair. I noticed the same levitations several times. In order to assure myself of this in a more thorough manner, I placed myself in the same location for several days, and after careful consideration, I saw the same transports in the air, which recurred with the speed and the ease of a light feather. Shortly before he died, Alphonse Liguori had a levitation on his deathbed. This occurred after he was told that the chapels were so crowded with visitors, the drivers themselves deserved to be called the real saints. And it was only 1 year after his death a trial was held to consider Liguori's canonization, and a total of 92 witnesses testified to having seen Liguori in levitation. He was canonized as a saint in 1839. So there you go, another amazing case witnessed by thousands of people in this instance. And yes, it happened a long time, but I think testimonies are compelling enough to prove that it really happened. Another amazing case involves someone who's actually photographed during levitation. This involved a medium by the name of AMEDEE ZUCCARINI of Italy. This case is reputable because it involves several scientists who were able to photograph the levitations on multiple occasions under controlled conditions. This exact event happened in 1908 when Zuccarini, who was a state employee in Bologna, Italy, attracted the attention of scientists with his ability to levitate, and his case was very closely studied by Dr. L. Patrizzi, a professor of physiology at the University of Modena, and by Professor Oreste Murani of the Milan Polytechnic Institute in Italy. They were able to take photographs of Zuccarini during his levitation episodes. Zuccarini was only able to levitate in complete or near complete darkness, so to overcome this obstacle, the scientists used magnesium flash photography. They would conduct a seance, and at the moment of levitation, they took the photographs. And using this method, the scientists took numerous photographs of Zuccarini in levitation. And the most famous photo shows the circle of 5 people at the seance, with Zuccarini floating about 3 feet above the floor in a perpendicular position, still holding hands in the circle. His levitations were invariably brief, lasting maybe 12 to 14 seconds. However, the stringent laboratory conditions in the photographs make his case particularly reputable, and that's why I included it as case number 8, because it was a modern case viewed by trained observers under laboratory conditions and photographed. It's truly an astonishing case. And now we're getting to one of my favorite cases. Case number 7, I chose a gentleman by the name of Yogi Masaharu NARUSE. This is an outstanding modern case which occurred in Japan. At age 12, Yogi NARUSE began to practice yoga with the hopes of freeing himself from all bondage and reaching nirvana. Throughout the 1970s, He visited many yoga masters throughout India. In 1976, he began teaching yoga himself. Years later, in 1982, he began to levitate. By this time, he had mastered many other supernatural phenomena, levitation being only one of them. In April of 1983, a series of 8 photographs were taken of NARUSE while in levitation. 5 years later, in 1988, he levitated more than 1 meter high and was again photographed. In 1990, he allowed himself to be photographed in levitation for one final time, but never again. In 1992, he wrote the book, which is published in Japanese, Levitation by the Method of Yoga. In 2001, Yogi NARUSE was conferred the title of Yogi Raj, and today he is still living and is considered one of the highest practitioners of Kundalini Yoga. He currently heads the NARUSE Yoga group in Tokyo. Yoga classes are open Monday through Saturday from 10:30 in the morning to 8 in the evening, and open to anyone who is willing to visit. What's interesting about Yogi NARUSE's case is not only is he a living practitioner of yoga and that it has also been photographed, but he provides detailed explanations on how he levitates. According to Yogi NARUSE, and I'm quoting, "It is to use instantaneously prana, or vital energy permeating in the universe. Place one's consciousness on the destination point for floating. According to the amount of consciousness increasing, existential reversal takes place and the physical self becomes evacuated. Then the physical body gets attracted towards the consciousness which has already been shifted to the destination. One can thus levitate." In other words, he's saying that he is able to have an out-of-body experience, focus his consciousness on a point directly above him, and once he's fully conscious in an astral state, the physical body is drawn up towards him. I love this case because the photographs are very clear. This gentleman is still living. There's a video of him on YouTube in which he talks about spirituality. It's truly an astonishing and very well verified case. And now we get to case number 6, which I call the case of CARMINE Mirabelli. He's one of the most remarkable levitators of the 1800s. He was born in 1889 and quickly became the undisputed leader of Brazil's spiritualism movement. He is, without a doubt, Brazil's most famous physical medium. Carmine displayed countless psychic abilities from a very young age and had numerous credible witnesses vouching for his reputation, including his entire extended family and his friends. And before long, he had conducted thousands of seances, producing virtually the entire range of mediumistic phenomena. Under a trance, he was able to speak in no less than 28 languages, 3 of which were dead languages, including 7 dialects. Important here, however, is his ability of physical levitation, which he performed on numerous occasions. During one seance, he was handcuffed to prevent trickery. He rose up in full view of several witnesses and then disappeared, the handcuffs falling to the floor. Later, he appeared in another room in the same home. 2 doors had to be unlocked to retrieve him. So apparently, he not only levitated, he teleported. At São Vicente, Mirabelli was tied to a chair by several scientists, skeptical scientists, from the Academy Cesar Lombroso. After he had been securely fastened, Carmine and his chair rose from the ground and remained suspended in the air for 2 minutes at a height of more than 6 feet, during which time the witnesses were allowed to pass to and fro underneath him. Carmine's feats continued. He could often produce full-color apparitions, And according to Mr. Boqueira, while driving through Santos, Brazil, he observed Carmine to levitate 6 feet above his automobile for a period of 3 minutes. On one occasion, a levitation was actually photographed. This photograph shows Carmine Mirabelli, hovering about 3 feet off the ground in a standing position. His face is turned upwards with an expression of awe and peace, as if he is beholding something of intense beauty. His arms are outspread in front of him in a posture reminiscent of the levitating saints. There have been some people who claimed, apparently without any evidence to back it up, that Mirabelli is standing on a ladder that had been airbrushed out of the photo. Whatever the case, there's more evidence pointing toward the validity of Carmine's case. English researcher Guy Lyon Playfair performed extensive follow-up research on Carmine Mirabelli and came away absolutely convinced of the genuineness of his case. As he writes, "One eminent Sao Paulo surgeon assured me that his father had seen Mirabelli leave the floor while sitting in his chair." Playfair also interviewed Mirabelli's son, Regine Mirabelli, who was a first-hand witness to a levitation. One day, his son peeked into his father's room and observed him sitting on the bed in a position of meditation, and as Regine says, "As I watched him, his body began to rise up in the air without changing position. Then he just stayed there, in midair about a meter off the bed, his legs and arms still crossed. That was enough for me, and I ran off to tell my mother as fast as I could." So there you go, another really well verified levitation. And now we get to the top 5 cases. And for case number 5, I chose the case of Stainton Moses. In 1870, Stainton Moses was a professor at Cambridge University, an author, a minister, a religious scholar, and the founding member of the British Society of Psychical Research. His sterling reputation for honesty and integrity was vouched for by many prominent citizens. William Stainton Moses was also a medium. He started out very skeptical, but after attending a few seances, he became absolutely convinced, and he then began to exhibit his own mediumistic talent. He later levitated on at least 10 occasions in front of many influential citizens. Well-known pioneering paranormal investigator Andrew Lang investigated Stainton's case and concluded that his levitations were, quote, "a miracle." These levitations occurred exclusively during darkened seances, and as Stainton Moses writes in his own words, "One day, on June 30th, 1870, I felt my chair moved away from the table and turned towards the corner where I had been seated, so that I turned my back towards the circle and faced at an angle towards the wall. Immediately the chair was elevated from the ground to a height which, after I was able to judge, came to be 30 to 40 centimeters. The chair stayed suspended for some instants, and then I felt myself leave it and climb still higher, then higher, and the movement very gentle and slow. I never had any apprehension, and I never felt uneasy. I was perfectly conscious of what was happening and described the progress of the phenomena to those around the table. The movement was very regular, and it seemed to us rather a long time to complete." He was actually able to take a pencil and make several marks high up on the wall near the ceiling, verifying that he had actually levitated. And he also left a vivid account of what it feels like to levitate, as he writes, "My sensation was that of being lighter than air. No pressure on any part of the body, no unconsciousness or entrancement. From the position of the mark on the wall, it is clear that my head must have been close to the ceiling. The ascent, of which I was perfectly conscious, was very gradual and steady, not unlike that of being in an elevator, but without any perceptible sensation of moment, other than that of feeling lighter than the atmosphere, of being completely free." He did also report a slight feeling of tightness in his chest and difficulty in breathing. As is the case with several saints, Stainton Moses was seen on occasion to actually emit visible light from his body, and also a flowery perfumed scent and other unusual but pleasant odors were emitted from his body, echoing the saints and their, quote, odor of sanctity. So Stainton Moses successfully levitated on at least 10 occasions in front of multiple witnesses under very carefully monitored conditions, making his levitations among the best verified in history. And now we move on to case number 4. In case number 4, I chose Joseph Cupertino, or as his Italian name is Giuseppe Cupertino. Giuseppe DESA of Cupertino. So although this case occurred many hundreds of years ago, the enormous number of witnesses, well into the many hundreds, and their credibility, which includes popes, dukes, priests, nuns, people of very high standing in society, make his case very hard to dismiss. And you have to remember, many of the people who gave testimonies were under oath when they gave their testimonies about Joseph DESA of Cupertino. This is in Italy, and is probably the most famous of all the levitating saints. Joseph was born in 1603, and at first he seemed a very unlikely candidate for sainthood. He was born into poverty. His father, who was a carpenter, sold their home to pay for debts and died soon after Joseph was born. Joseph himself was reportedly very withdrawn, excitable, not very smart, sort of dim-witted, and had a club foot. One of his feet was deformed. As a child, people nicknamed him the Gaper because of his vacant, slack-jawed expression. But even from an early age, Joseph showed a very strong interest in religion and experienced his first, quote, ecstatic trance, at age 8. At age 17, he was apprenticed to a shoemaker, but was fired for incompetence. He was rejected twice by the Franciscans because he couldn't even perform simple tasks. He would drop the dishes, let the fire go out, and often fell into these ecstatic fits during which he was unable to work. But his transformation finally occurred after being hired as a stable boy by the Franciscan friars at Cupertino. He became devoutly religious and spent much of his free time in prayer. He lived very ascetically, wearing a scratchy hair shirt, often ate only twice a week, and would flagellate himself so that his entire body became covered with wounds. They nicknamed him the human scab. At age 22, he was admitted by a stroke of luck to the novitiate, and it was then that his levitations really began. His levitations were so numerous and witnessed by so many people of high credibility that they are very difficult to deny or debunk. And usually Joseph would levitate when he was exposed to anything of any type of religious nature. The mere sight of a religious statue or a painting could send him flying up into the sky, as even could the sound of a prayer or religious music. And on each occasion, Joseph would let out a very characteristic shriek, and he would float quickly upwards. During several of his levitations, he was so overcome with ecstasy that he would embrace heavy stone statues that are much too heavy for a single person to lift, and carry them up into the air with him. He would sometimes mistake fellow monks for famous religious figures and grab the monk and carry them into the air with him. During several of his levitations, he was so overcome with ecstasy. His first recorded levitation that we know of occurred while saying Mass at a monastery in Naples. Mass had just begun when he fell into a trance and levitated from the corner of the church, flew across the room to the altar, and the event was viewed by several stunned witnesses. After this, the levitations came fast and furious. While visiting Assisi in Italy, he entered a monastery to pray when he saw a painting of the Virgin Mary, and he instantly floated into the air 15 feet over a group of more than a dozen witnesses. He also levitated outside in the open air. On at least one reported occasion, while walking outside, he observed a baby lamb, and that was enough to send him into an ecstatic trance. And a fellow brother, seeing Joseph's reaction, handed him the little lamb, and Joseph grabbed the lamb, placed it on his shoulder, and ran into the garden. The other priests followed him, eager to see if this ecstasy would result in a levitation, and sure enough it did. Joseph rose into the air with the lamb and hovered in a kneeling position among the trees for a period of no less than 2 hours. So Joseph's levitations were very easily provoked. On one occasion, a priest, Antonio Sciarello, uttered the words, "Oh, how beautiful has God made heaven!" And that was enough for Joseph to rise up and levitate, and he perched on the thin top of the branches of an olive tree, very thin branches which could not hold his weight, and he remained there again for about 2 hours, until finally Antonio Sciarello, the priest, had to fetch a ladder to get Joseph down. One Christmas Eve, shepherds in the church were playing religious music on their pipes, and that launched Joseph DESA an estimated 40 feet across the church to the high altar. And as one witness, a shepherd, testified, "We then saw Brother Joseph. He was so joyous, starting to dance to the sound of the music, but all of a sudden he gasped and uttered a loud cry. At the same time, he rose up in space in the middle of the church, flying like a bird to the main altar, a good 25 meters. But the most amazing part of the affair was that the altar was covered with lit candles. Brother Joseph flew, set himself among the candles, and disturbed neither candle nor candlestick. He stayed thus so, kneeling above the altar, hugging the altar in his arms for about 15 minutes. Then he descended from the altar, disturbing nothing. He went away from us, his eyes pouring tears. All of us were saying, 'My brothers, that was enough to be blessed by the love of God.' We were all afraid and astonished from this devotion. I said to myself, 'It certainly is a miracle.' Several of the nuns observed this incident and began screaming, 'He will catch on fire!' But they were assured by Brother Lodovico, who had observed Joseph's flights before, that he would not be burned. Joseph DESA apparently had the ability, which we now know is called immunity to fire. So he exhibited numerous supernatural abilities. And on the feast of Saint Francis, Joseph was seen levitating while holding a lit candle, passing 14 paces through the air in front of a large group of monks. And once, upon seeing a cross, he levitated 15 feet up into the air and remained suspended on the edge of the pulpit, hugging the cross. It's clear that he was able to exert some control over his flight path, because on one occasion he flew around several lamps and ornaments that were obstructing his way to the altar. And upon seeing this levitation in progress, Joseph DESA's superior ordered him back, and Joseph promptly reversed his path and landed in the exact place he had just vacated. In one of his episodes, some of his fellow brothers would try to wake him up by sticking needles or burning his flesh with candles. Joseph took no notice, he didn't feel it, and the candles had no effect on him. And afterwards he would wake up and humbly and laughingly apologize for his state, what he called his giddiness. On July 15th, 1657, he experienced a well-known recorded levitation upon seeing the cupola of the Notre Dame de Loretta. He cried out, raised 6 feet above the ground, and flew nearly 100 feet into an almond tree. The sight of an altar often sent him into a trance, and this occurred on at least 15 known occasions. One altar-induced levitation was particularly memorable because at that time he hadn't levitated for almost 2 years. His ecstasies and his levitations had stopped after a hostile superior repeatedly humiliated and persecuted him. And after visiting Assisi, the sight of the image of the Virgin Mary stopped this dry spell and sent him sailing 15 yards to embrace her. On another occasion, officials were guarding the holy relics of St. Francis, and they saw Joseph approach. And as soon as he saw the relics, he uttered his characteristic cry, flew up backwards over their heads, landing behind them on the stone tiles. So often Joseph appeared to be unaware of his surroundings during these levitation trances, and on one occasion, a priest observed Joseph levitating and a slipper fell off Joseph's foot, and Joseph took no notice of this. One levitation was particularly memorable, and this levitation displayed another supernatural ability of supernatural strength. At that time, there was a 36-foot cross had been constructed, but due to its immense size and weight, 10 men were unable to lift it and put it in the stand that had been built along the roadside outside of Cupertino. Joseph DESA happened to be passing by, and as he observed the cross from the doorway of his church, as soon as he saw it, he, quote, rose like a bird into the air. At this point, he flew 70 yards, grabbed the cross, and lifted it up as if it were a piece of straw, and quickly put it in its place. On another occasion, he saw the statue of Jesus. He let out a yell, fell into a trance, and floated 8 feet off the floor, grasped the heavy stone statue, which he lifted up, still holding the statue, and floated down the hallway and carried the statue to his room. Sometimes he would grab other people and carry them up into the air. On one occasion, he heard religious music. This provoked a levitation attack, and Joseph rushed up to his confessor, grabbed his hands, and they both flew up to the center of the room. Once he saw a wax statue of the baby Jesus above the altar. He cried out, flew up to the statue, and clutched it to his chest, floated about the room for several minutes in numerous different postures. Another very similar event occurred at the Church of Santa Chiara in Cupertino. Several novitiates were being honored with a festival when Joseph Besa heard the Latin words, Vena Sponsa Christi, which means, come, bride of Christ. And at this point, he felt a levitation coming on. As one of the witnesses said, giving his accustomed cry, he ran towards the convent's father, Confessor Raphael Palma, who was attending the service, and seizing him, grasped him by the hand, and finally both rose into the air in an ecstasy, the one borne aloft by Joseph, the other by God himself, one being beside himself with fear, but the other with sanctity. So reportedly, this event happened on many different occasions. Joseph Desa has also been credited with curing people. On one occasion, he cured Balthazar Rossi, a local madman, someone who had gone insane. He had formerly been a very prominent citizen, but somehow lost his mind and had to be physically bound to prevent himself from hurting himself and others. One day Joseph approached him, untied this man, Balthazar, and told him to have no fear. He grabbed Balthazar and levitated with him for a period of about 15 minutes, after which the man was cured of his insanity. So very quickly, Joseph's reputation grew, and he was often called to pray for the sick. On one occasion, while praying for a patient, he rose up into the air and came back down on a table crowded with dishes. In May of 1649, while attending a patient's deathbed, Joseph was seen to levitate while in prayer. And once while praying in the church of Saint Gregoire in Naples, Italy, he uttered a loud cry, startling all the people present, and flew up to the altar. He was seen to levitate before the images of the Virgin on many occasions, and one of these levitations reached a height of at least 30 feet. According to Father Juniper, a first-hand witness, he saw Joseph levitating after or while listening to the boys' choir. As they sang, Joseph approached and floated a few inches above the ground. The boys stopped singing and surrounded Joseph to pass their hands beneath his feet. Often when Joseph said Mass, he was seen to balance on the tips of his toes in apparent ecstasy. So Joseph's levitations became famous all across Europe. He became known as the Flying Friar of Europe, and enormous crowds gathered to witness the miracle of the Flying Friar. His fame caused many people of very high social standing to come and view these levitations, and they were viewed by numerous officials, including several cardinals, the Duke of Medina de Rio Seco, and the daughter of Charles Emmanuel I the Great, the Duke of Savoy, Catherine of Austria, and many others. Perhaps the most significant and highest official witness was none other than Pope Urban VIII. During a visit with Joseph DESA, Joseph DESA knelt down and kissed the pontiff's feet, at which point Joseph rose into a levitating trance. Pope Urban VIII was so impressed that he declared that he had witnessed, quote, a true miracle. Another official of high standing was Johann Frederick, the Lutheran Duke of Brunswick, who traveled to Assisi for the purpose of seeing Joseph in levitation. The Duke of Brunswick was not Catholic, so he had to be sneaked into the church. And as he watched, Joseph gave out his customary cry, floated into the air, moved backwards, and then towards the altar where he returned to the ground. Johann Frederick, the Lutheran Duke of Brunswick, was so overcome with emotion he began to cry. He returned the next day to observe Joseph levitating again for a period of about 15 minutes, and he was so impressed by what he witnessed that he converted his religion from Lutheran to Catholicism. Another very memorable levitation occurred in 1645 when the Spanish ambassador to the papal court had heard about the levitating saint and called for a meeting. And according to a researcher by the name of Gezzi, in 1645, the Spanish ambassador to the papal court, the High Admiral of Castile, passed through Assisi to see Joseph, and after speaking with the saint in his cell, he returned to the church and told his wife, I have spoken with another Saint Francis. Upon hearing this, his wife also wanted to meet Joseph, and at her request, his superior commanded him to go to the church and speak with her. I will obey, Joseph said, but I don't know whether I'll be able to speak, and he hastened to comply. Scarcely had he entered the church when, looking upon a statue of Mary Immaculate on the altar, he flew about 12 paces over the heads of those present to the foot of the statue. After remaining there some time in prayer, he flew back with his customary cry and returned to his cell. The occurrence amazed the admiral and his wife and their retinue, and according to some accounts, the admiral's wife actually fainted and needed strong smelling salts to recover. So many people observed his levitations. According to one account, and this is a first-hand witness talking, several religious whom he helped fold a habit worn by Saint Francis saw him hover in the air above their heads. Others saw him suspended on a cornice in the chapel of Saint Francis about 8 inches from the floor. One day, while a priest was preaching in the chapel of Saint Ursula, Joseph flew from a balcony that jutted out in front of the altar. He remained suspended in a kneeling position before the tabernacle until his superior's command. He flew back to the balcony. So there are many witnesses. Another was the Bishop of Martelli of Spoleto, Bernardino Beneducci, and Archange Rossini, each of who testified under oath to having seen Joseph in flight. In fact, the Bishop of Spoleto wrote, "The ecstasies of which he was favored are known by all the world. I have seen him, and several of the people of my house have seen him, as have I, raised up 4 fingers from the ground." So Joseph was very, very famous, and his case caused a lot of controversy. Church superiors feared that he was becoming a cult figure, and the growing crowds of people flooded into the area and followed him everywhere he went. So many people came that they had to erect temporary housing to contain the increasing throngs of spectators. And it was around this time that Joseph was accused by his superiors of seeking publicity and trying to create false miracles. He was investigated by the Inquisition, and the decision was made to put him in isolation. And for more than 35 years, Joseph was forbidden to say Mass, to take part in any processions, choir practice, or anything that might cause one of his levitation episodes. He was shielded from all religious icons of any kind and was moved from one friary to another to avoid spectators, but was eventually returned to his original friary, where he remained in almost total seclusion. But even all these precautions weren't enough to stop the crowds of followers or to stop his levitations. And St. Joseph of Cupertino, his levitations are definitely among the most numerous of all levitators. There are at least 70 recorded episodes. And although he left no written impression of what it felt like to have one of these levitations, he always called it my giddiness and would apologize afterwards. He once told one witness, "I'm very sorry, my body is out of order." It was 100 years following Joseph's death that Pope Benedict the 14th examined the eyewitness accounts of the levitations, of which there were hundreds. The report of Joseph DESA in the Acta Sanctorum was in excess of 1,000 pages and listed 70 separate flights. And although normally skeptical of such miraculous events, the Pope wrote, and I quote, "Eyewitnesses of unchallengeable integrity gave evidence of the famous uplifting and prolonged flights of Saint Joseph when wrapped in ecstasy." Prosper Lambertini was one of the investigators at Joseph's trial for canonization to make him a saint, and he also came away convinced. As he says, and I quote, "At the time when I exercised the functions of the promoter of the faith in the sacred congregation of the rites, they examined the cause of the venerable servant of God and examined his virtues there, and following that I resigned from the functions of the promoter, the question resolved in a favorable manner. In this cause the eyewitnesses, whose integrity is above suspicion, deposed on the subject of the very famous elevations from the ground, the grand aerial flights of the ecstatic servant of God." So Joseph's levitations continued until his death at age 60. Joseph's doctor, Francesco Pierpaoli, testified to church officials that he also witnessed several levitations. During one examination with several doctors, Joseph spontaneously levitated 3 feet above the chair. Dr. Pierpaoli attempted to pull him down, but did not have the strength to do so. And this happened at least 3 times. As Pierpaoli testified before church officials, "I noticed that he was raised about a palm over the said chair in the same position as before the rapture. I tried to lower his legs down, but I could not. It remained stretched out." So Joseph's case is definitely among the strongest on record. And as Olivier Leroy, the author of the first book on levitation, writes, "If there is a cluster of cases on levitation which appear from the outset compact and varied enough in order to resist the testing of the proposed rules, it is manifestly that which we find in the life of Joseph of Cupertino. The existence of Joseph of Cupertino appears to have been organized in order to prove the existence of levitation because of the number and the variety of the phenomena and the diversity of the places where they were produced, joined with an intellectual quality, social and moral, of the witnesses who verified them. In order to reject these witnesses, it is necessary to admit to an organized hoax or a collective hallucination of unbelievable power. Alban Butler, who wrote a multi-volume series called Butler's Lives of the Saints, was also similarly convinced and writes, Saint Joseph's life was one long succession of ecstasies, miracles of healing, and supernatural happenings on a scale not paralleled in the reasonably authenticated lives of any other saint. Saint Joseph of Cupertino, in both the extent and number of these experiences, provides the classical examples of levitation, for if many of the early incidents are doubtful, some of those recorded in his later years are very well attested. Pioneering researcher Herbert Thurston agrees and said it is very difficult to believe that they, the witnesses to Cupertino's levitations, could have been deceived as to the broad fact that the saint did in fact float in the air as they were convinced they had seen him do under every possible variety of conditions and in many different surroundings. So yeah, Joseph was definitely the most famous levitating saint, I think, of all times, and his case is absolutely authenticated. Joseph was canonized in 1767 and is now, suitably, the patron saint of air travelers, pilots, and students, and many biographies have been published about his life. And now we get to the top 3 cases of levitation. For case number 3, I choose Eusapia Palladino. Eusapia is a medium who became world famous for her levitations. She was born in 1854 in Naples, Italy, and her levitations are perhaps the most studied in history. She traveled across Europe for more than a decade, visiting and convincing one scientist after another, displaying her incredible mediumistic abilities under very strict laboratory settings. Eusapia Palladino rose from obscurity, and she became one of the most famous spiritual mediums in history. She did seances for years when she finally began to attract widespread attention, and in 1889, an Italian scientist by the name of Le Chevalier Chea and a Spanish professor, Don Manuel Otero Acevedo, began conducting seances with Eusapia. And as Dr. Chea writes, Mr. Otero was the closest to the medium and perceived the first unexpected ascension because they felt her arms rise very gently, and not wanting to let go of the hands of the medium, they held on to her during her ascension. This splendid case of levitation was even more deserving of attention as it took place under the most rigorous surveillance and with the lightness of a feather. Eusapia Palladino was then observed to perch lightly on a table in a trance state, and the scientists were amazed and asked out loud if it was possible for Eusapia to levitate again. And as Dr. Chea writes, immediately Eusapia was lifted 10 to 15 centimeters over the table, and each of us were able to pass our hands under the feet of the magician suspended in the air. And the next event also astonished the scientists. Eusapia's head was resting on the edge of the table while the rest of her body extended horizontally in the air without any visible support. As Dr. Chea writes, although this was produced in darkness, this important feat was observed scrupulously with the greatest care by all and in a manner that rendered it most evident as if it had taken place in broad daylight. And while many of these levitations did occur in darkness, Dr. Chea later did observe Eusapia to levitate in full light. As he says, I had the occasion to be a witness to a thing even more extraordinary. One evening I saw the medium extended in the state of the most complete catalepsy, holding herself in a horizontal position with only the head supported by the edge of the table for 5 minutes under the light of gas lamps, in the presence of Professor de Sintist and the well-known writer Dr. Capuano, Mr. Frederick Verdunois, and others. So this is when EUSAPIA began to be intensely studied. 3 years later, in 1892, more than a half-dozen eminent European scientists studied EUSAPIA's abilities, including Giovanni Schiaparelli, the director of the Astronomical Observatory of Milan, and Karl Duprel, the doctor of philosophy in Munich, and Angelo Brothario, the professor of philosophy, and Giuseppe Garroso, the professor of physics, and other prominent scientists. One very prominent scientist was Cesare Lombroso, who was a psychologist at the University of Turin and the founder of modern criminology. Another prominent scientist was Charles Richet, a physiologist at the Faculté du Médecin in Paris and a soon-to-be Nobel Prize winner. All of them observed EUSAPIA under controlled conditions to levitate in the air with her chair after she would be set gently down on the table. As Cesare Lombroso writes, the chair with EUSAPIA in it was not violently dashed, but lifted without hitting anything on the table, and Mr. Richet and I are sure that we did not even assist the levitation by our force. So they got a scale which measured her weight, and they were able to repeatedly record a reduction in EUSAPIA's weight under fully controlled conditions. On 2 occasions, Richet and Lombroso held her hands. EUSAPIA levitated completely off the ground and was set on a table. EUSAPIA voluntarily allowed herself to be studied like a lab rat, and many scientists of various disciplines studied her abilities. The well-known researcher Hereward Carrington, who conducted his own levitation experiments, was one scientist who observed her, but there were many others, all of whom observed her to levitate fully or partially, or produce a wide variety of mediumistic phenomena, and all of them came away convinced. So she is definitely one of the most studied and best authenticated levitators in history. As one witness writes, I became a witness to the levitation of the medium into the air in the middle of the room without any support. She was then in a trance state and was lifted up gradually, slowly and lightly into the air, all the while staying erect, and came back down just as slowly and lightly on the floor. Another scientist, Mr. Ochorowicz, witnessed another levitation. As he says, another feat more surprising and more rare was the complete levitation of the medium's person, held at all times by the hands and feet, levitated from the ground and carried with her in a state of catalepsy onto the table. In passing my hands under her ankle boots, I was able to establish that between her and the table there was a distance of 4 to 5 feet. So many scientists wanted to have a chance to study EUSAPIA, and she always agreed to be studied. And in 1895, she was studied by a specially selected commission of European scientists, very high-level scientists, including Colonel de Rochas, administrator of l'École de Polytechnique, the Baron de Watteville, a master of physical scientists, and many others. And these experiments were successful. EUSAPIA was able to prove over and over and over again under controlled laboratory conditions that she had this ability to levitate. And not only levitate, she had other strange abilities, like some of the saints. EUSAPIA was able to actually change her height, a phenomenon known as elongation. Like many other mediums, she was able to speak in many different languages and would occasionally emit light or perfume from her body. Scientists often put her body on a scale to measure her weight, and this showed that she actually lost weight not only during the seance but afterwards. On a few occasions in her very later years, there were a few accusations of trickery, but nevertheless, scientists were unable to account for most of the phenomena she produced. And as the well-known psychical researcher Nander Fodor writes, the levitations of EUSAPIA Palladino are among the best observed cases. And now we get to case number 2. This is exciting. For case number 2, I chose Saint Teresa of Avila. Of the more than 330 known cases, I think Saint Teresa's case rises well above the rest. Although she lived nearly 500 years ago, her feats are still remembered today, probably because she was a prolific author and an incredible mystic. Her works are still considered classics of mystical literature today and are still in print. She was born in 1515, and although she tried to hide her strange abilities, large numbers of people witnessed her levitations, many who left recorded statements. Saint Teresa became a nun at a very early age, but she didn't take it really seriously. It wasn't until she turned age 40 that she saw some of the other nuns who appeared to her to be sort of shallow and taking the whole religious vocation not very seriously. This is when she decided to become serious in her religious studies. She was very dedicated to spirituality, and despite suffering from very ill health, she left her convent and traveled across Spain and founded the Reformed communities of Carmelites, which was a very strict and devout religious institution. Saint Teresa spent much of her time in prayer, and it was during these very long prayer sessions that she first began to experience levitations, and she didn't like them. She found them very frightening, very awkward, and distracting, and she prayed that her episodes would stop. As she once wrote, "Do you think it is a small disturbance for a person to be very much in his senses and see his soul carried off, and even the body, without knowing where that soul is going, what or who does this, or how?" So this started with out-of-body experiences for her, but soon transformed into full-on levitations. And to her annoyance, these episodes continued. On several occasions, when she started to levitate, she would call her fellow sisters to hold her down so that she could continue doing services. On other occasions when this happened, she ordered everyone out of her convent, and only when she felt an approaching episode. When Saint Teresa received the Holy Communion, she did this thousands of times, of course, but on rare occasions during this, she would sometimes rise into the air and hover. One person who viewed a levitation was Bishop Yeps, and this occurred when she was about to receive the Holy Host from the Don Alvaro of Mendoza, who was then the Bishop of Avila. She reached out and grasped the grill, and the bishop quickly administered the sacrament. Several of the witnesses there watched the levitation, and Teresa quickly realized her predicament and threw herself bodily to the ground. Many people who observed her levitations talked about it under oath during a church inquiry into Saint Teresa's life. One witness was Sister Anne, who testified, "On one occasion, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the daytime, I was in the choir waiting for the bell to ring when our Holy Mother, Saint Teresa, entered and knelt down for perhaps the half of a quarter of an hour. As I was looking on, she was raised about a half a yard from the ground without her feet touching it. At this I was terrified, and she, for her part, was trembling all over. So I moved to where she was, and I put my hands under her feet, where I remained weeping for something like a half an hour while the ecstasy lasted. Then suddenly she sank down and rested on her feet, and turning to me, she asked who I was, and if I was there for a long time. I responded yes, and she ordered me under obedience to say nothing of what I had seen, and I have in fact said nothing until the present moment. At least 9 other first-hand witnesses testified to Teresa's levitations during this church inquiry, and some reported that Teresa's body was actually luminous, giving off visible light. These episodes were common enough that Teresa was often seen clutching the ground in a vain attempt to keep from levitating, and one priest reported that Teresa levitated while standing in a choir with the other nuns. As she watched, she grabbed at the floor mats to hold herself, but still rose up into the air, still holding the mats. On another occasion, St. Teresa was listening to St. John of the Cross. He was speaking of the Trinity when suddenly he levitated, and St. Teresa, caught up in the rapture, floated up in a kneeling position to meet him. At that moment, Sister Beatrice walked in and saw both of these saints hovering in an ecstatic trance. This incredible event was later memorialized in a painting hung in the church. So what's interesting about St. Teresa's case is that she was actually able to give a first-hand account of what it was like to levitate. As she wrote in her 1565 autobiography, which her superiors ordered her to write. She didn't want to do it, but she was under orders to do so. Teresa described exactly what it feels like. As she says, and I quote, "When I tried to resist these raptures, it seemed that I was being lifted up by a force beneath my feet so powerful that I know nothing to which I can compare it, for it came with a much greater vehemence than any other spiritual experience, and I felt as if I were being ground to powder. It is a terrible struggle, and to continue it against the Lord's will avails very little, for no power can do anything against his. If we resist out of humility, the same effects follow as if we had given it our entire consent. These effects are very striking, and one of them is the manifestation of the Lord's mighty power, as we are unable to resist his Majesty's will, either in soul or in body, and are not our own masters. We realize that, however this irksome truth may be, there is one stronger than ourselves, and that these favors are bestowed by him, and that we ourselves can do absolutely nothing. This imprints in us a great humility. I confess that in me it produced great fear, at first a terrible fear. One sees one body being lifted up from the ground, and although the spirit draws it after itself, and if no resistance is offered, does so very gently with great sweetness. One does not lose consciousness. At least I myself had sufficient to enable me to realize I was being lifted up. The majesty of him who can do this is manifested in such a way that the hair stands on end. Teresa tried very hard to resist these, but she just found it impossible to do so. As she writes, "No means of resistance is possible. With rapture, as a rule, there is no such possibility. Often it comes like a strong, swift impulse. Before your thought can forewarn you of it, you can do nothing and anything to help yourself. You see and feel this cloud or this powerful eagle rising and bearing you up with it on its wings. You realize, I repeat, indeed see, that you are being carried away, you know not whither. For though rapture brings us delight, the weakness of our nature makes us afraid of it, and we need to be resolute and courageous in soul, much more so than what has been described. Occasionally I have been able to make some resistance, but at the cost of great exhaustion, for I would feel very weary afterwards, as though I had been fighting with a powerful giant. At other times resistance has been impossible, and my soul has been borne away, and as a rule, my head also, without being able to prevent it. Sometimes my whole body has been affected to the point of being raised up from the ground." So Teresa did her best to stop it, but she couldn't, and she also wrote of what it felt like, these weird physiological and mental effects. As she says, I can testify that after a rapture, my body seems as light and buoyant as if all weight had left it. Sometimes this is so noticeable that I could hardly tell when my feet were touching the ground, for while the rapture lasts, the body often remains deaf and unable to do anything. It continues all the time as it was when the rapture came upon it. In a sitting position, for example, with the hands open or shut, the subject rarely loses consciousness, is undisturbed, and though incapable of action with respect to outward things, the subject can still hear and understand, but only dimly, as though from a long way off. So although St. Teresa's case occurred many, many years ago, it's particularly reputable not only because there are outside witnesses, but because she gave very long and detailed explanations of what it was like to levitate. As Olivier Leroy, the author of the first book on levitation, writes, we can leave our prejudice aside and clearly admit this case. Herbert Thurston was also a pioneering researcher into levitation and says of St. Teresa, to my thinking, the most satisfactory example of this phenomenon is to be found in the case of St. Teresa. The importance of her case lies in the fact that she was seen by others raised in the air, but that she herself bore witness to the reality of these levitations. At the same time, no one who has studied her life and writings will be disposed to question either her good faith or common sense. So that's the case of St. Teresa, which is so astonishing and well verified with her own written account that I had to give her the number 2 spot on the case of the top 20 levitations. And now we get to case number 1. Drum roll. The case for number 1, I chose the case of Daniel Douglas Home. This is arguably the best recorded levitation of all times in all of human history, and it comes from this remarkable man, Daniel Home. He was born in 1833. As a child, he had many psychic experiences which culminated in him becoming the single most influential spiritual medium of his time. His fame, I think, rose from the simple fact that he was able to produce a wide variety of inexplicable paranormal events virtually on demand. He started holding seances as a teenager, and by his early 20s, he was already a highly celebrated figure traveling across the United States and the world, keeping audiences with numerous heads of states, kings, queens, dukes, leaders in art and literature, religion, science, and politics. He met with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the famous poet. He met with Mark Twain. He even met with the Pope. He met with Tolstoy, who witnessed a levitation. As Tolstoy wrote in a letter to his wife, Home was levitated in his chair. I held his feet while he floated over our heads. So Holmes' case is astonishing, and not once was he ever caught in any kind of trickery, though his case was certainly controversial. While many people during his time were able to produce physical spiritualistic phenomena such as table lifting or apparitions, none were able to equal Daniel Holmes' abilities. He not only produced all of the above phenomena, but many more, including miraculous healings, glowing lights coming from his body, superhuman strength, incombustibility, elongation, and most importantly here, levitation. He was a normal child by all accounts, though of very delicate health, and his career as a medium was pretty much assured at a very young age when poltergeist-like activity broke out in his home in Connecticut. So he was already holding seances and giving readings for people in his neighborhood, and it was during these early seances that the spiritualistic phenomena was produced. And it happened so quickly for him that it became very clear that this was going to be his life's work. But he himself was surprised when he began levitating at age 19. This occurred in 1852 during a seance at the home of a Mr. Cheney in South Manchester, Connecticut. As many of the expected manifestations were produced, one of the sitters suddenly shouted out, as she says, suddenly and without any expectations on the part of the company, "Mr. Home was taken up in the air. I had a hold of his hand at the time, and I and others felt his feet. They were lifted a foot from the floor. He palpitated from head to foot, apparently with the contended emotions of joy and fear which choked his utterance, and again he was taken from the floor, and the third time he was carried to the ceiling of the apartment, from which his hand and head came into gentle contact. I omitted to state that these later demonstrations were made in response to a request of mine that the spirits give us something that would satisfy everyone in the room of their presence." The medium was much astonished and more alarmed than the rest. So this was his first levitation experience, and he had no reason to expect a repeat performance. However, it did happen over and over again in front of countless witnesses, making him definitely the most famous levitators of all times. In 1857, Daniel visited the home of a count and countess in France, and during a seance there, he levitated. Home wrote about this in his 1864 biography, Incidents in My Life. As he says, and I quote, "The lady of the house turned to me and said abruptly, 'Why are you sitting in the air?' And on looking, we found that the chair remained in its place, but that I was elevated 2 or 3 inches above it, and my feet were not touching the floor. This may show how utterly unconscious I am at times to the sensation of levitation. As is usual when I have not got above the level of the heads of those about me, and when they change their position much, as they frequently do, and looking wistfully at such a phenomena, I came down again, but not till I had remained so raised about a half minute from the time of its first being seen." In 1859, Daniel visited Bayswater in England, where he conducted a seance, and one of the people present was J.G. Crawford, who was then a very vocal skeptic. After this seance, however, J.G. Crawford changed his tune and wrote, and I quote, "A very curious affair took place, an explanation of which I cannot hazard a conjecture. Mr. Home remarked, 'I feel as if I'm going to rise.' The room was quite dark. He said, 'I am getting up,' and as I was only a few feet from him, I put my hand to him, and I indubitably felt the soles of both of his boots rise some 3 feet above the level of the floor, and on doing so, he said, 'Don't touch me, or I shall come down.' Of course, I instantly desisted, but down he came. In less than 5 minutes after this, he remarked, 'I am again ascending,' and from the sound of his voice, we could but not infer that he was actually rising towards the ceiling of the anteroom. He then appeared to float in the archway, and then to rise to the cornice of the room where we were sitting, and we heard him quite distinctly make 3 marks on the ceiling. Then he came softly down and lay stretched out with his back on the table, in which position we found him when the gas was lighted, and we distinctly saw the marks on the ceiling where we had heard him make." In 1860, Daniel went to London and gave a remarkable demonstration of his levitation abilities. As one witness says, "After a pause, Mr. Holmes said he felt as if he was about to be lifted up, and he moved from the table and shortly said, 'I am rising.' But we could not see him. 'They have put me on my back,' he said. I asked, 'Will you kindly bring him as much as possible towards the window so that we may see him?' And at once he was floated with his feet horizontally into the light of the window, so that we all saw his feet and a part of his legs resting or floating in the air like a feather, about 6 feet from the ground and 3 feet above the height of the table. He was then floated into the dark, and he exclaimed, 'They have turned me around, I am coming towards you.' And I saw his head and face, the same height as before, as if floating on water instead of air. He then floated back and came down." So while he often floated in darkness or near complete darkness, many times people did see him in rooms that were light enough to verify his levitations. And it was not always the case that he levitated in darkness. In many cases, the light was more than sufficient for people to see him rise upwards. In July of 1860, Daniel held a seance at the home of a prominent Englishman in London, and one of the attendees was a prominent citizen by the names of James Wasson, who was a very wealthy man from Liverpool, England. And as James Wasson writes, Mr. Holmes stated that he was being lifted up in the air, and he crossed the table over the heads of the parties sitting around it. I asked him to make a mark with his pencil on the ceiling, and he said he had no pencil. I rose up and said I would lend him mine, and by standing and stretching upwards, I was enabled to reach his hand about 7 feet distant from the floor, and I placed therein a pencil, and laying hold and keeping hold of his hand, I moved along with him 5 or 6 paces as he floated above me in the air, and I only let go of his hand when I stumbled against a stool. Mr. Home, as he floated along, kept ringing the small handbell to indicate the locality in the room, which was probably 40 by 30 feet, and I saw his body eclipse 2 lines of light issuing from between the top of the door and its architrave. Mr. Home was replaced, as he stated, with the greatest care and gentleness in the chair from which he rose, but this I could not see. So Daniel was fully booked at all times to give seances. In 1861, he was giving a seance with 7 sitters, when again he was levitated. One of the witnesses, John Jones, writes, 2 of the 3 gas lights were now put out, and the fire burning brightly gave a subdued light in the room. Mr. Home then became cataleptic in his hands and arms, and he was raised from his seat till he stood upright. Then he rose vertically till he was a foot above the floor, his head level with the chandelier. This was repeated twice. So many people saw him levitate in conditions that were light enough to view him. But what often happened is when he was viewed too closely or people stared at him, this caused the energy that was levitating him to be broken, and he would slowly float to the ground. So this was very strange. So he attracted the attention of a lot of researchers. One was William Howitt, a spiritual investigator who attended several of Holmes' levitations. And as he says, Mr. Home was lifted about a foot from the ground, but did not float as he frequently does in the strongest light. Once he was staying in England at the home of a witness who witnessed at least 5 separate levitations. As she writes in her diary, Mr. Holmes' arms were raised, and he walked to the end of the room where he was lifted off the ground and raised until his feet were on a level with the top of the chiffonier, between 4 and 5 feet off the ground. I distinctly saw his body carried along erect in the air. It then returned to its former place, where it remained for some time. At length it floated forwards in the air, passed behind the gas chandelier which was suspended in the center of the apartment, and he then descended gently onto the floor, close to the chair in which a lady was sitting. When he descended, his arms were paralyzed, but in a short time they returned to their natural state. She also witnessed a rare levitation in which light was emitted from his body. As she says, Mr. Home was now led to the end of the room, which was very dark. He was raised from the ground, and a beautiful star was visible, and also one like a small comet. He said a star was on his forehead and one in each hand, and we saw the 3 very bright, and many others glancing about. He was fixed against the wall. The luminous appearance was so distinct as to render the papering of the wall perfectly distinct, and he floated along the room and was placed on his knees on the sofa. Again he was carried up and floated along the room. So many high-level citizens saw him levitating. Among them was Lord Adair, a young British nobleman who accompanied Daniel on many of his adventures and observed many outstanding levitations from 1867 to 1869. In fact, Lord Adair wrote a privately published book about his experiences with Home, but he soon withdrew it from publication because it was generating intense controversy. It was on December 13th, 1868, that Daniel had his most famous levitation. In this case, his levitation took place in London, and he was levitated outside the window of a 5-story building and back in through another window. This event was witnessed by Lord Adair, Lord Lindsay, and Charles Wynn, all very highly regarded citizens. And the levitation was so spectacular, it was widely criticized as being impossible, yet all 3 witnesses and Home himself have never retracted their statements that this took place. On December 20th, 1868, Lord Adair reports that he and several other witnesses saw Home rise out of his seat and float to the ceiling in full view. And on still another occasion, Lord Adair witnessed a very rare outside levitation. As he writes, "Presently we all saw him approaching, and eventually he rose off the ground. He floated by in front of us at a height which carried him over the broken wall, which is about 2 feet high. There could not be a better test of being off the ground, for as he crossed the wall, his form was not in the least bit raised, but the movement was quite horizontal and uniform. The distance that we saw him thus carried must have been at least 10 or 12 yards." By this time, many scientists were converging to study Daniel Home. One of these was a Russian scientist, Alexander von Butlerow, and using a weighing device, he discovered that Home could change his weight, or change the weight of a 100-pound table to fluctuate from 70 pounds to 150 pounds by simply resting his fingers lightly on the table. Another scientist who came away absolutely convinced was Professor Robert Hare of the University of Pennsylvania, who is best known for his invention of the blowtorch. A very prominent supporter of Daniel Home was Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently of Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution. So Home's supporters continued to grow, and Lord Lindsay testified that he once saw Home, and I'm quoting, "in full light standing in the air 17 inches from the ground." Probably Daniel's leading supporter was Sir William Crookes, a leading British scientist who decided that he was going to expose the fakery of spiritualistic phenomena. In 1871, he studied Home's abilities and observed a first-hand levitation under carefully controlled laboratory conditions, and quickly became Home's biggest supporter. As William Crookes writes, "There are at least 100 recorded instances of Mr. Home rising from the ground in the presence of as many separate persons. This has occurred in my presence on 4 occasions in darkness, but I will mention only those occasions in which the deductions of reason were confirmed by the sense of sight. On 3 separate occasions I have seen him raised completely from the floor of the room, and on each occasion I had the full opportunity of watching the occurrence as it was taking place. On one occasion he went to a clear part of the room, and after standing quietly for a minute told us he was rising. I saw him slowly rise up with a continuous gliding movement, and remained about 6 inches off the ground for several seconds when he slowly descended. On another occasion I was invited to come to him when he rose 18 inches off the ground, and I passed my hands under his feet, around him, and over his head when he was in the air. On several occasions Home and the chair on which he was sitting at the table rose off the ground. This was generally done very deliberately, and Home sometimes tucked his feet on the seat of the chair and held up his hands in full view of all of us. On such occasions I have gone down and seen and felt all 4 legs were off the ground at the same time, Home's feet being on the chair. Less frequently the levitating extended to those sitting around him. Once my wife was thus raised off the ground in her chair." So Crookes was of course totally convinced, though he wasn't happy about it because he believed in science and he could not explain what was happening here. And as he writes, "The phenomenon I am prepared to attest to are so extraordinary and so directly opposed the most firmly rooted articles of scientific belief, the ubiquity and invariable actions of the force of gravitation, that even now, on recalling the details of what I witnessed, there is an antagonism in my mind between reason, which pronounces it to be scientifically possible, and the consciousness of my senses, both of touch and sight, are not lying witnesses. He is absolutely convinced that Holmes did levitate because he saw it himself, and as he says, to reject the recorded evidence on this subject is to reject all human testimony whatsoever, for no fact in sacred or profane history is supported by any stronger array of proofs. Another very prominent scientist who became a convert was Dr. Hawksley, a well-known English physician. Holmes came to Dr. Hawksley's home, and Hawksley witnessed him to levitate on a table at least 8 inches high, and was able to verify the levitation by passing his hands underneath the table legs. As Hawksley writes, "That which I have known of Holmes' life and his abilities leaves me absolutely convinced of his veracity, his honesty, his good vigilance, and of the noblesse of his character." So as you can see, there's no shortage of witnesses to Holmes' levitations. On one occasion, he was standing under a tree when he had what is known as a crisis levitation. It saved his life. As Holmes wrote in his biography, "Suddenly I was seized by the collar of my coat and vest and lifted off the ground." He was deposited a few feet to the side, at which moment a large branch fell from the tree and landed where he had been only moments earlier. On several occasions, he experienced partial levitations while bedridden with severe illness. His head would be lifted up and his bedspread or his pillow would be adjusted. And there were many other levitations of this kind. Holmes often said that there's a peculiar effect that the human touch or even light can disturb his levitations, which ideally occur during low light levels. What does it feel like to levitate? Well, he did give a first-hand account, and his descriptions are among the most detailed recorded, as he says, and I quote, "During these elevations or levitations, I usually experience in my body no particular sensations other than what I can only describe as an electrical fullness about the feet. I feel no hand supporting me, and since the first time above described, I have never felt any fear, though I should have fallen from the ceiling of some rooms in which I had been raised, I could not have escaped serious injury. I am generally lifted up perpendicularly, my arms frequently become rigid and drawn above my head, as if I were grasping the unseen power which slowly raises me from the floor. At times when I reach the ceiling, my feet are brought on a level with my face, and I am, as it were, in a reclining position. I have frequently been so suspended for 4 or 5 minutes. On some occasions, the rigidity of my arm relaxes, and I have, with a pencil, made letters and signs on the ceiling, some of which now exist in London." So as can be seen, Daniel Holmes' levitations are so numerous, so widely documented, so widely observed by multiple independent, highly reputable witnesses, it's very difficult to account for them unless they are true. As Olivier Leroy writes, "With Daniel Holmes, it is particularly difficult to dismiss and doubt the totality of the testimonies which establish the reality of this phenomena." And while Holmes' reputation was occasionally attacked by skeptics, anyone who came to him to test his abilities came away convinced. One of the worst criticisms came from Count Spada, who, after witnessing Holmes levitate, couldn't explain it and said that he thought Holmes exercises on the people present an entrancing fascination which makes them see something that isn't there. So that's why I gave Holmes the #1 spot, because he's levitated so many times under very rigorous conditions in front of scientists over and over and over again, and it was never once caught in trickery. Daniel Douglas Holmes died in 1886 at the age of 53 years old. So that's my top 20 list of the best human levitation cases in all of recorded history. I'm sure other people might have come up with a different list because there are many other fantastic cases. There are some 330 recorded cases. I've interviewed at least a half dozen people who have experienced this firsthand. And so I am absolutely personally convinced levitation is a real phenomena. I wrote about these cases and the many hundreds of others in my book, Human Levitation. And I really think it's important people understand that we have the ability to fly and we have many other superhuman abilities. We have really only begun to learn how truly powerful and wonderful it is to be a human being. I think it's very important that we all start to wake up to our own natural abilities. Humans have the ability to fly. It's absolutely amazing. And that's why I wanted to do this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know it's been a long program, but I felt it was very important that people know this. So thanks once again for watching. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep having fun.